the world of Jesus and the apostles was one that was dominated culturally by Greek or Hellenistic culture. Now, that's kind of important for me because I'm from Melbourne, which is the second largest Greek city in the world. And on any given Saturday, you can walk around churches and reception areas and you're bound to see at least one big fat Greek wedding full of souvlaki and baklava. That spread of Greek people and Greek culture goes back to the 4th century BC with the conquest of Alexander the Great, where he and his armies went east. They went into Egypt, into Syria, Palestine, all the way into Persia. In addition, wherever Alexander went, he would establish Greek cities, and these cities would be run like a city back in Greece with a Greek constitution. It would also have some very prominent centers, like a gymnasium. And by the way, an ancient gymnasium wasn't just a place where young men go to buff up. It was a place where they could train their bodies and train their minds, where they could meet with their peers, they could cultivate social networks. And you would also have in these cities philosophical schools and agora. Hand in hand with the spread of Greek culture was the spread of Greek religion. Wherever Alexander went, he would build temples to the Greek gods. And many of the ancient cities that he was founding or he was conquering, they would absorb Greek gods into their pantheon. So for example, in Rome, their god Jupiter was simply a Romanized version of Zeus. And with the spread of that also was the spread of Greek philosophies. Their ideas about the divine, about the afterlife, that spread as well. The spread of Hellenistic culture forced the Jews to grapple with a very important question. How much could they enculturate themselves within the Hellenistic world? Some Jews took to Hellenism with great enthusiasm. They either abandoned their way of life or they reinterpreted through a Greek lens. Others regarded Greek culture with some degree of hostility. They regarded it as pagan and something fundamentally against the things of God. When the first Christians began to spread throughout the Hellenistic world, they faced the same question. How could they be in the world but not of the world? How much of Greek culture could they absorb? And they were facing many of the same questions as diaspora Jews. How do they live in the city and yet be faithful to their own gods, their own way of life? So the first Christians were faced with very similar questions to their Jewish contemporaries. How do they participate in the Hellenistic polis, in the Hellenistic city, without compromising their faith, their ideals, their way of life? And that, by the way, is probably a similar question we face today. How do we negotiate our way in the world by keeping what we value, what we hold dear, and our beliefs? It's a question that the church has to wrestle with in every age.
By the time that Jesus of Nazareth was born, more or less the whole of the Mediterranean world was under the control of Rome, whether directly or indirectly. The Roman Forum here was the place where decisions were made which affected people all the way from Spain right through to Judea and Egypt and beyond. How had that come about? And how did that context change and transform and illuminate and indeed threaten the life of the early church? It all goes back a long way because Rome had been quite a powerful city-state for hundreds of years, gradually extending its influence in Italy and then through both trade and conquest further afield. Of course, Alexander the Great, 3 centuries before, had more or less turned his bit of the world Greek, but much of that had not lasted in terms of direct rule from Greece over the rest of the world, but it had been a cultural influence seeping into the way people thought, the things they did, the books they may have read. Whereas with Rome it was a bit more direct and brutal. As in the late years of the Republic, the last 2 centuries BC, the Romans extended their influence, their military domain, their power and their prestige. But Rome had always been a democracy, at least for the last few hundred years. They'd had tyrants way back when, they decided that wasn't a good idea, and so instead they had a complicated system of checks and balances where the different social classes would be able to get along more or less together. And each year they elected 2 men to be consuls, and they would serve in office just for that year, and then they would go off and work abroad for a while, thus preventing anyone getting too powerful. But when Julius Caesar did become too powerful for the liking of most of them, then they assassinated him in 44 BC, precipitating the whole Roman world into a time of chaos, of civil anarchy, and of civil war, They didn't actually fight the civil war here in Rome. They exported their wars into places like northern Greece. And it was only sometime later, in 31 BC, that Julius Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, finally defeated Antony and Cleopatra, and he became master of the Roman world. And what Octavian then said about what he'd done and who he was and how all that worked had enormous influence in shaping the world of the next generation, the world of Jesus of Nazareth, the world into which Paul came with his gospel. Because Octavian declared that he had brought peace to the world, he had brought salvation to the world, he had brought justice to the world. A new day had come, a new day had dawned, because he was hailed as the son of the deified Julius. Julius Caesar had been declared to be divine after his death, and Octavian, his son and heir, therefore was designated Son of God. It's on the coins. And the coins introduce us to the symbolic world of Rome. The symbols, which were so tiny you could put several of them into a little purse, in other words, coins, and the symbols which were so massive that they took weeks, months, and years to build, like some of these temples and triumphal arches behind me. And all of these symbols said, we Romans have conquered the world by our military might, and as a result, we have brought justice and peace to the world. Peace as a result of conquest, justice as a result of our military might. And so all these symbols gathered together, and they didn't just exist here in Rome, because wherever the Romans went, they planted colonies. Colonies like in Corinth and Philippi, dozens of other places around the world, precisely the world into which Paul went with the gospel. And everywhere where they planted colonies, people said, we want this to look like and be like and feel like Rome itself. That's the world we want to live in. And so when the gospel went and Paul proclaimed in a place like Antioch that Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of God, was the Savior, and that he had revealed the divine justice before the world, then this was directly in your face to the claims of the Roman Empire. Of course, for Paul, this language came straight out of his Bible, the Old Testament, where it was the divine justice that was exemplified and acted out in God's mighty acts in history. But we can see from the beginning that there was going to be a clash of categories. And so that the story which was told by Octavian's court poets, people like Virgil and Horace, was a story of the ancient republic turning at last into a monarchy with one man who summed up all the virtues and blessings of Rome. And over against that, Paul and the others told a story of the true God and his purposes through history, with the story of Israel coming to its great climax in the arrival of the true Son of God, the Savior of the world, Jesus himself.
If we're going to consider the Greco-Roman world into which the New Testament was birthed, in which the apostles preached the message of Jesus, we need to remember that the ancient world did not have something called religion as we would ordinarily understand it. Now, if by religion one means a body of theological beliefs with a supernatural content and various ethical corollaries that can be compartmentalized from a secular culture, then obviously no, there was no such thing as religion in the ancient world. And there's not even a word in the ancient world that translates into religion in that sense. The Latin word religio has the meaning of scruple, in the sense of one's duties towards the gods, not a sort of comprehensive worldview about gods, humans, and their relationship. In Greek, the main terms we find for religious activity are also found in the New Testament, and that's words like eusebeia for piety or godliness, or thraiskia for worship or service, and that's which is associated with it. And this language pertains to the practice of cult and ritual, not a web of beliefs and worldview. The word religion only gradually came to be used in the ancient world in relation to Christianity when it was fashioned in a way of separating cult from culture. The idea that there might even be different religions was something of an innovation in the late 16th and early 17th century. Religion in the ancient world was principally nothing to do with theology, the afterlife, or even ethics. It was largely about these rites and rituals. And whatever religion was, it was never possible to neatly segregate it from politics or economics or the wider culture. In fact, all these things were deeply connected together.
Now, if we had to distill the substance of religion, we could say that it pertained to negotiating the relationship between the divine world and the human world through ritual observance. The purpose of rituals was to gain divine favor of the gods for human existence, to secure the pax deorum, the peace of the gods, whereby harmonious relationships could be maintained between the divinities and mere mortals in their daily affairs. That in a nutshell is what ancient religion is about, probably very different to how we conceive of religion. We've seen that the early church, like the apostles Peter and Paul, they were Jews living in a world that was culturally Greek but politically dominated by Rome. What were the challenges they had to negotiate living in that world?
Well, living and just trying to live out being a follower of Jesus the Messiah in that world, the challenges come one on top of another, because we sometimes think that what they were doing was giving them a new religion, but actually Christianity didn't look like a religion. They didn't have priests, they didn't have temples, they didn't have animal sacrifices, they didn't go and study oracles at places like Delphi. Nevertheless, they did do things which bound them and Jesus together, like the Lord's Supper and like baptism, and those were in a sense religious, but in a different framework. Likewise, they were rather like ancient philosophers, teaching people how to think, teaching them who the gods were, or in this case, who the one God was, and teaching them how to behave, but they would have clashed with the other philosophers of the day, because the other philosophers knew nothing at all about the Jewish world in which one God might actually come and act in the world and transform it. And then on top of all of that, of course, in the Roman Empire, there was great suspicion about any groups who were meeting behind closed doors, without permission, as it were. Who do you think you are? What are you getting up to behind there? And when it leaked out that these people were singing hymns to the Messiah as to a God, or that they were saying things like Jesus is Lord, and the word Kyrios, Lord, is a word that would be used of Caesar, then all sorts of rumors would run around. These people are saying there is another emperor. These people are subversive. They're turning the world upside down. So that the challenge they faced was both to be who they were called to be, which in a sense was to be loyal to Jesus as the new alternative Lord of the world, if you like, and to do all those things, to think it through, to act it out, but to do so in such a way that made it clear that this is a new way of being human, which actually affirms everything that was good about the old way of being human, but transforms it, so that it isn't that they're just against everybody about everything. They're not retreating from the world, they're claiming to transform the world, and that's why they have to have their minds transformed. And so the challenge comes at every level, at a social level, at an intellectual level, at the spiritual level, how they then pray, how they then witness to Jesus in this context. And this is the odd combination that the early church faced, and we see it going on into the 2nd century as well, where people like Justin Martyr are saying, in effect, yeah, we are not going to be loyal to Caesar, we are going to stay loyal to Jesus, but actually we are good citizens, we love our neighbors, we are kind to people, we do good in the world. And the church from the very beginning had this sense both of dancing to a different drummer and actually of doing so in such a way that had a positive message and not simply a negative one for the rest of the world. Very difficult.